Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we're continuing with our classes on Rav Tzadok HaKohen's Machshavos Charutz, imagination in the teachings of Rav Tzadok. And where we left off last week was with a working definition of what thought is. We showed how Rav Tzadok points out that the essence of man is to think, is to be a thinking creature. But in truth, there's three frames of thinking. There's the root of thought, there's the midpoint of thought, and then there is the extension of thought. There's the machshava stima'a, the origination of the possibility of thinking without any particular thought. There's chachma, which is thoughtful thinking, which is actually creating images in my mind that have the capacity of framing experience. And then there's the third lowest expression of thought, which is the machshava hachitzoni, which is the never-ending perpetual ruminations of the mind and its activity. And we also pointed out that for Rav Tzadok, the innermost point of Chachma, which is that midpoint of thoughtful thinking, which defines human creativity and the ability for a human being to make meaning in this world, it must be remembered that it is fundamentally connected to the innermost point in the heart, and that Chachma and Bina, the mind and the heart, or the heart of the mind and the mind of the heart, are integrally connected at every point, train rein delim misparshin. And so the definition of thought is thoughtful thinking, meaning to say, thinking about the world and about experience and framing it in a meaningful way. But in addition to the framing, it's the ability to draw that frame down into the lived experience of feelings in the heart. That point where in human experience becomes visceral, it becomes real, a person is in contact with life through the heart. And so we describe thinking as the emergence of the possibility of creating images and shapes that give shape to experience and ensuring that it has an impact on our lived experience in the depths of the heart. And so Rav Tzadok now is going to come and describe to us a symptom that emerges from the end of thought. And then after describing the symptom that emerges from the end of thinking, we're going to return back to the essence of thinking, which is this thoughtful thinking, this capacity to make reasonable ideas and frames that enable us to live life in a meaningful way, which is ultimately the light of the Torah and mitzvos, the secret of the Chachma B'Kadosh Baruch Hu. The third layer of thought, we said, is the active mind, the beginner's mind that is perpetually running like the second hand on a clock that doesn't end. It's meant not to stop. To imagine the stoppage of thoughts is to abstract oneself from that lowest part of thinking. But on the lowest part of thinking, there's a perpetuality to thought. There's ruminations. There's an encircling upon encircling that creates a certain posture, a certain outlook, the cognitive distortions and the positive cognitive strengths that we see ourselves and we see others and we see the world through. That place in the mind that is never quiet. And the goal of meditation is to silence it to the degree that one thought can emerge. But it's like a busy highway with 7 lanes and thousands of cars driving over each lane throughout every hour. And it's overwhelming. The thoughts are never ending, and we're not quite sure where they begin and where they end. And when we have an overwhelming thought and we want to trace the beginning towards the end, whoop, there through the work of ruminations, we find ourselves right at the beginning, in the dizzying space of the machshava hatamidus. That's the third quadrant of thinking. There's the concealed thought, which is thinking without thoughts. There's the midpoint of chachma, which is thoughtful thinking. And then there's the lowest quadrant, which is thoughts without thinking, where it's just information and noise that has been translated into our minds through either vision or auditory experience that now has become part of this busy highway of the ever-moving mind. And because that place is not so much within the bechira of the individual, because it's moving in perpetuality, it's a lahat hacher mesapeches. It's moving so speedily that it appears to be standing still. Sometimes a person is not aware that their mind is active. But when we gaze down into it and we look into it, we come to find that there's 1,000 different thoughts that are populating my mind and that I'm sitting upon or holding or taking too seriously or not taking seriously enough, et cetera, et cetera. And from that place where we lose sight with thought, where we lose sight of the control over our thoughts, because it's no longer thoughtful thinking, but it's just thoughts that continue even after the act of thinking is done, there's a certain symptom that emerges there called dimyon, called imagination, dimyonos, imaginings, projections, introjections, assumed things about the world which are not real in any other place other than the conjecture of my own mind. And the danger of dimyon, as we're going to see, the danger of imagination is what Rav Tzadok introduces us to first. Like we said, Rav Tzadok's project is the redemption of imagination. And at the outset, Rav Tzadok feels the need, as I understand it, to clarify what dimyon is not. And once we can clarify the danger of dimyon, and we can steer clear of this roadblock that can mess up our whole orientation to imagination, then we are free to try and understand dimyon in the refined, holy way that Rav Tzadok teaches us. But that's not without first and foremost realizing the one pitfall and the one roadblock that can destroy a person as a result of their imagination. And so talking about the symptoms that emerge from that part of the mind that's not so much under our thoughtful control, because it's just thoughts that are repetitive and I'm not choosing to think them necessarily. There's an outgrowth that comes from those machshavos, which is dimyonos. Dimyonos, the danger of imagination, Rav Tzadok lays out fundamentally and very, very clearly, both from an ontological perspective as well as a historical perspective, is that the danger of imagination is that a person can come to imagine themselves as perfect. The danger of imagination is that one can come to imagine themselves as perfect. And we know that the essential imperfection of the human being is the hallmark of what it means to be a created being, to be deficient in the eyes of a perfect creator. And that in spite of the fact that the experience of spirituality is a ladder that climbs all the way up to infinitude, and there's gradations and growths, and I can refine and refine and refine and become holy and holy and holier. In the end of the day, the most fundamental principle at the heart of imagination and the Torah is that kedushasi lamala me kedushasechem. My holiness, says God, is always transcendent to your holiness. No matter how holy, no matter how refined, no matter how whole a person, a creature can imagine themselves, the wholeness and the perfection of the Creator will always be something that is completely removed from fathomability or graspability or our ability to even relatively speak of his perfection. Yes, we can grow. Yes, we can attach ourselves to wholeness and experience wholeness, but that wholeness is simultaneous with the very guarded innermost point, which is that I am deficient at the same time. I come to find wholeness within my deficiency because I represent the secret of deficiency from within wholeness. But in the end of the day, the human being must come back to a place of realizing that kedushasi l'ma'ala mikdushasechem. Now, imagination is where, through the configuration of reality through my mind, and the realization that there is a freedom of thinking that enables me to kind of shape my orientation to the world. So when imagination enters into that place, a person can then imagine themselves being stronger, healthier, more spiritually illuminated than themselves. And that's how that imagination destroys a person in their individual lives. But there is an ontological and spiritual truth here, which is that the danger of coming to a place of thinking that we can be perfect is the polar opposite to the belief in God. The belief in God is that God is perfect. Only Hashem is perfect. The danger of imagination is that the self can come to imagine that it can create worlds. And if it can create worlds, then it's just like God who can create worlds. This was exactly what the Nachash said to Adam. It said that if you eat from this tree, you will know good and evil, and you will be able to be like God who creates worlds. And we saw from the tzaddikim that it was fundamental for Adam HaRishon to prove that that's not the case, that we can never create worlds like God, because only God can create real yesh me'ayin. Only God is perfect. The human being is always in a process of relative perfection or relative perfectibility of becoming better and better, to the point that I realize that the ceiling and the apex of this stage of my experience reveals itself to be the floor of the next stage of experience. And just like Avram in this week's Parsha, that after experiencing tamimus and wholeness and completion, the next step is sitting at the opening of the gate, as the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh teaches, that we know that there are 50 gates of understanding that are revealed in the world, and only 49 were given to Moshe, and the 50th was lacking from him. And the Baal Shem Tov says that the 50th gate is the recognition that there's another 50 gates, and another 50 gates, and another 50 gates, ad infinitum. So the announcement that we cannot be perfect, or the renunciation of the possibility of being perfect, does not mean that we have to live and wallow in imperfection. It just means that we are always aware of the context in which our growth is taking shape. But if a person realizes the power of imagination, that we can form the way in which we look at the world, that we can imagine reasons that are thought up and conjured up, just as we do in Lumdus and in the attempt to give hidden reasons to things that are seen and revealed. The danger of this is that to cultivate a narrative where one is their own creator, where one is their own God, where one can be perfect, is to then live in a world that's devoid of godliness, is to live in a world, God forbid, where I'm God. And if I'm God, then there's no room for Hashem. As Chazal tell us that anivuhu, right, that when a person is sitting with this sense of selfness, or that I'm the one who's creating everything through my dimyon, through my projections, through my capacity of magical thinking, so then the light of Hashem cannot be present there. It doesn't reveal itself there. It's only in the acknowledgement of the inherent deficiency of the human being, which protects us from creating worlds in which we're our own gods and falling into this solipsistic, ana emloch, shvira breakdown, traumatic breakdown of when a person thinks that they're the center of the universe because they can create narratives. We create narratives within our partiality. We create the narrative through imagination and the rendering of new configurations of thinking that enable life to be meaningful in accordance with the Chachma Ha'amiti. But we don't for a moment forget about the fact that we are imperfect, not because we're bad, not because we're broken, but because we're not God. And by dint of the fact that we're not God, by definition, that means that there will be a perpetual imperfection at the heart of the human being. And imagination is what makes shape out of that place. But if imagination is used, heaven forbid, to make oneself into a god and to conceive of the ability to create new narratives and just make up my own reality and deny the reality that's beyond me or deny the reality of others because I imagine it as so, so that's when a person is going to fall into all sorts of spiritual malice and a person is going to wreak destruction rather than cultivate spiritual growth. And Rav Tzadok says that this is ultimately what happens in Jewish history. We have this historical trauma where the teachings of the Arizal in response to certain historical elements were manipulated and utilized in a way which was destructive through Shabtai Tzvi and his followers. And the names of the Rishonim should be erased, meaning the Rishas from within the names of Jewish people should be erased. Nishmas Yisrael always has a tikkun, but the ugliness and the badness should be erased and it should be mavutal, but Nishmas Yisrael should have every ounce of tikkun that it possibly needs. So Shem Rishon Yirkov is that the Rishas within the names of Yisrael should crumble away and fall away, but that the Nitzatz Eloki from whatever a person was should be oila and it should make a Kiddush Hashem, and because Leis Aser Panimine and Leval Yidach Mimenu Nidach, and that there's a redemption for everything. But Rav Tzadok HaKohen says that the Kas HaArura, the cursed group of the students of Shabtai Tzvi, who created a real traumatic response after them, and they created a real uncertainty surrounding all matters Panemius related. They affected, to a certain degree, the purity of the receptivity of the Arizal in the world, which is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends so many tzaddikim tahirim and with anava, with profound humility, to reveal the correct understanding of the Arizal. And he sent us the Baal Shem Tov, which was a rectification of this moment in history of Shabtai Tzvi. The Baal Shem Tov came along to rectify the extended impact that Shabtai Tzvi had wrought on the Welt. So this was a real trauma. This created a real blockage. And yes, obviously there was growth that came out afterwards as everything, that first it's darkness, then it's light, because the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh comes along, and the Gra comes along, and the Rashash comes along, and the Ramchal comes along. Not the Ramchal. And the Ramchal comes along. But Rav Tzadok is saying the danger of imagination unhinged, the danger of assuming that I have more power than I actually have, or that I'm greater than I actually am, or that I can be more perfect than a human being, is what leads a person astray, is what makes a person take God out of their world. When a person feels that they can experience a level of perfection, and whatever physiological substance-induced perfection that a person might feel, or whatever dopamine levels it takes to get to this imagined place of perfection, the mind that assumes perfection is possible kind of takes a mental snapshot and it wants to maintain that kind of hedonic set point of perfection perfection and anything else is imperfect. So a person protects themselves against their imperfections and overspeaks their perfection, like Paro, who stood upon his God, right? He stood upon the Nile River, because for someone who demands perfection in their world or in their lives is ultimately serving the role of God. And therefore, the actual place of God is beneath a person's feet. And Paro had to deny the fact that he was a human being. He denied the fact that he goes to the bathroom. That's the danger of Dimyon. That's the danger of imagination that makes me assume myself to be more whole than I actually am, more in control than I actually am. But Dimyon, when it's refined, as we're going to see, is going to be the site of Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah and Sha'ashuei Da'oraisa, and the ability to reveal more light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world. And so Rav Tzadok is saying that the outgrowth of the lowest third of thinking, which is the active mind that's no longer measured or supervised by the real side of thinking, which is thoughtful thinking, which is chachma, which is koachma, which is the tikkun of all things. So then it can fall and descend down into broken imaginations and arrogance and power, and it can leave the person feeling that they can be perfect. And that's the source of all deficiency in the world. All deficiency comes from the fact that a person feels that they don't need Hashem. But when a person realizes that they need Hashem and that we're deficient creatures, and leis lamagami klum, and that nishmas Yisrael is malchus that yearns and is ma'ir man, and through our desire and our yearning and our hope, we draw down more illumination, and prayer is an active participation in the reality that the human being is a deficient thing, not a deficient thing that was once perfect and now broken, but rather a perfectly deficient thing, which was created through a secret of a partial wholeness, that it's a chelek eloi kamimal, that we're a fractal of infinitude rather than a fracture of infinitude, but we're still not infinitude itself. That's the rectification of imagination. That's what the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh came along and showed. And Rav Tzadok also points out that this nature of imaginings and imagination and dimyon doesn't only apply to the lowest third of thinking, because dimyon, as we're going to see, is the end of thought. At every stage of thinking, whether it's the machshava stima'a, which is the thinking without thoughts, the highest point of origination of thinking, if it's the chachma itself, which is the thoughtful thinking, or if it's the lowest expression and extension of chachma, which is thoughts without a thinker, in each of those spaces, there's going to be an element of dimyon. And just as there are symptoms that come about at the bottom of the lowest layer of thinking, so too there are going to be elements that emerge in the inner quality of thinking and in the source of thinking. That dimyon is not simply some fallen symptom, but rather it is present and part and parcel of the system at every stage. Biyad ha-nevi'im adam. Nevuah is not a mistake. Nevuah is not something, oh, we have Yetzer Hara, I might as well use it and give them Nevuah. No, Nevuah is built into the very reality of the individual, which is our capacity to imagine, to be Madama Milsa La Milsa. But again, with the prerequisite awareness of what our limitations are. And let's see the words of Rav Tzadok. We're in Os Aleph, Beis. Says Rav Tzadok, Ukemat ein adam sheyihyeh naki legamrei gam belevush hachitzoni mehamachshava sheyihyeh bilti laHashem levado. It's almost impossible for there to be an individual who is completely clean on the external garment of thought, that their thinking should be completely connected to God alone and nothing else. And that there's not going to be a point in their lives where a certain vagrant thought enters into their minds. This happens to each and every person. It might only happen for a moment, but it happens to everyone. The Chet Adam Harishon, the sin of Adam Harishon, Haya b'machshava kemo she'amru b'tikunei Zohar sham v'sham. The original transgression of Adam was by way of thinking. And the way in which it emerged was the lower quadrant of thinking, which became imagination. V'zehu hadimyon shehichnis bo hanachash, b'ma she'amr v'hayisem ke'elokim v'gomer. The beginning of the chait was the imagination that the nachash, this foreign element of the recognition that I can form my narrative, that's the nachash, and it enters into my mind and it tells me that I can be like God. This thought that I can be like God is the root of all of the wasted, chaotic, meaningless imaginings and thoughts within the individual. to imagine themselves as if they are operating at a more perfect level than they are actually operating. V'she'ein ra'ui lo, in a place that they have no connection to. Kol echad kafi hasagaso. Each and every person has their own standing, and each and every person has the threat of imagining themselves to be more perfect than they actually are. Each and every person can imagine themselves as lower than they are also. But the danger of imagination is when I imagine myself to be more perfect than I actually am. The Adam Harishon Shahaya Betachlis Hashlemus, and Adam Harishon, who was the most perfect that a human being can be perfect, Al Derech Ani Amarti Elokim Atem. Like Chazal have told us that with regards to Adam Harishon, we almost said, and I was like God. That on that level of perfection, or of the closest thing that a human being can be to perfect, because Adam Harishon was not perfect. This is a fundamental principle at the core of Pnimiyas HaTorah, that Adam Harishon was placed in Gan Eden la'avda u'lashamra, to guard and to cultivate, both of which imply deficiencies, a deficiency of a threat on the outside and a deficiency of a need of preparation on the inside. And we know that Adam Harishon and the worlds were not created in a perfect state, but rather Adam was meant to own his imperfection, rectify it, bring it back up closer, and bring all of existence back up closer to God, so that everything can re-enter into a new stage of unfathomable infinitude. But it was never going to be the perfection of Adam Harishon, no matter what level a person ascends, no matter how far high up the aliyos of the levels go, there will always be a quality of godly perfection that is going to exceed human consciousness, human grasp, by dint of the fact that we are not the creator. Only God is the creator. So the Nachash, what the Nachash does is hichnis bo dimyon shihi yamam mishkein. The Nachash introduces this notion that when Adam Harishon hears that a person can be like God, or can follow the attributes of God and act like God, so to say, that he received the information in the wrong way, and it said you can actually be like God. You can actually be perfect like God. And in order to fix this notion of the ability to be perfect like God, the Torah has to warn us to be holy. Kadoshim tihiyu. Be holy. The implication is be as holy as one can possibly be, theoretically without limit, to equal the holiness of God. Chas v'shalom, but that's the original possibility of that statement. So Chazal had to come along, as they say in Vayikra Rabbah, Yochel Kamoni. Perhaps you may have thought that this perfection that I'm offering to you, this holiness, this refinement, this fixing, this growth that I'm offering is going to be on par with the perfection or the growth of God. Talmud Lomar, the Gemara comes to say, Talmud Lomar, that no, it can't be, because Kedushasi l'mala mikdushasechem. My holiness will always exceed your holiness. So then what does it mean, Kedoshim Tihiyu? It means imitate my holiness. Ki, a dimyon, ki'ilu. It's as if I can be like God. The same way that we say, Kula kaima kiloi chashiva, that all of the worlds are as if they don't exist, because until God reveals that absolutely nothing exists but him, it's still as if all of the worlds don't exist. But the lo chashiva, the level of where it's going to be fundamentally revealed that all is God and there's no separation between creation and creator, even that is going to come to reveal another kilo, another higher level of imagination of as if there's no worlds. And then we'll come to a revelation that there are no worlds. And then we'll come to remember that it's as if there's no worlds, that the as if, the kilo of kula kaima kilo chashiva, that the entirety of existence and all of the worlds are as if they're null and void and as if they don't exist in the face of God's infinitude, becomes the vessel, becomes the levush, becomes the external garment that holds the light of kula kaima lo chashiva. It's literally like there's no worlds. Because the only way we can ever grasp is the fact that there's literally no world and that all that exists is God and that there's no separation between creator and creation, is to remember that there will always be, from our perspective, a limitation, which is that it's only as if there are no worlds. Because as long as we're created and as long as we're human, as long as we know that we're creatures, and even when we don't know that we're creatures, and even after all of the aliyos and all of the ascensions, the creature will never be fundamentally unified with the creator, because the unity of the creator is something that is far beyond the capacity of anything to comprehend, grasp, even by way of negation itself. There will always be an imperfection. And so Chazal come along and they teach us that Yochel Kamoni, you thought that maybe you could be perfect like God. Talmud Lomar, no, you could only imitate God. You can utilize your imagination to imagine that you can be perfect. Because this is what happened to Adam Harishon with the first damage that imagination brought to the table. Because again, imagination is on a certain level the closest we can come to God, as we're going to see. Because what imagination does is it creates something out of nothing. And just as God creates something out of nothing, imagination offers us a slight gesture of the possibility of nevuah, which is where God is directly communicating with us. But because prophecy has left, we're left with this inner capacity to imagine, which reminds us that we're worthy of Ruach HaKodesh, that place of the dream. But we have to always remember that it is not perfection. And even Adam Arishon, ki keshehu betachlis hamadrega me kedusha, ad sheyidme lemelache hasharas, hu bekoyach habechira shabo ein hayetzahara menicho lo'olam klal. Adam Arishon, who was operating at a level of such holiness, he was created on such a level of holiness that they thought that he was an angel, and he assumed that it was by way of his free choice and his free will, and he came to a place of assuming that there was no more Yetzer Hara and that it would leave him alone forever. So the Nachash comes along, umesito sheyachol lehiskadesh kavyachol kamohu mamish. The Nachash offers this imagined promise, this trickery, this seduction of Adam Arishon, that you can perfect yourself. You can make yourself so holy that it's almost going to be kamohu mamish, that you become almost like God. And in Adam's mind, there was no separation. If a person comes to make this mistake with imagination, they come to see the imaginative capacity as something more than just the God-given gift to recreate and reconfigure reality as it is in front of us, in accordance with what the Torah has taught us, in accordance with what the Tzaddikim give us, in accordance with self-nullification that knows that it's imperfect and it's not trying to be in control or perfect. That if those checks and balances are not there, then imagination can be something that throws a person from the loftiest heights down to the abysmal depths. Like we said, that the evil should be erased. The evil should be erased. Not the neshama of Yisrael, but the evil should be erased, and everything should have a tikkun. Like we saw what happened to Shabtai Tzvi. That as the result of the intense renunciation of physicality and the attempt to live in nothingness and the attempt to live in Shamayim with transcendence and removing themselves from physicality and not engaging, it was only the second generations that were involved in real physicality. The original generations of this caste, this group, were Prushim. They refrained, they stayed away, they were holy, they acted holy. They acted holy. And as a result of that, the sense of imagination was strengthened within them, and they came to conjure up the possibility of being able to almost be exactly like God. Lidmos la'elyon. And the reason for this was that they started off thinking they were perfect. They started off thinking that Kedusha was a self-given thing. They saw themselves as self-begotten, God forbid. They saw that Koach of Kedusha as self-begotten, without realizing that Kedusha is a perpetual work. And this is the secret of the Nachash and the snake and the imaginative nature of the drives, the way that it takes us away from ourselves. It starts with a little bit until it wants us to conceive of ourselves as God. And the way and the place where Dimyon really reveals itself most ferociously is the external garment of thought, which is that third quadrant of thought, which is where the mind is no longer in control of itself. And Tzadok now is going to show how this has an impact on all of history. This is the work that we have to do to clarify our dimyon, to come to a place of remembering that we're imperfect, and kedushasi lamala mikudushasechem, and coming to realize the yearning, and that's the true nature of thinking. A thought, not that brings me up to a level of perfection, that allows me to draw down that secret sight of content making and framing reality and drawing it into my heart. As long as the original transgression of Adam Harishon has not been rectified, which should be fully rectified with the arrival of Mashiach, who we hope for, who should arrive now. So as long as that hasn't been fixed, each and every person has their own misuse of dimyon. Each and every person has these imagined concepts or imagined things that they tell themselves about themselves, or that they say to other people about the world, or that they imagine about the world. All of us with our narratives, all of us with our frames where we're in control. And don't think that this imagination, which drags a person down into this power struggle where they think that they're in charge because they can create something from nothing, which leads to all arrogance, and it leads to a sense of perfection, and it leads to all destruction. But even someone who's rectified in their holiness and really doing the work, they have the ability to make a mistake and fall into the unhealthy forms of different imaginations where they are thinking that certain things are very meaningful, but in truth, they're missing the point. They're missing where they stand in this world. They're contemplating the wrong thing. This principle has a fundamental impact. Like we said, a real machshava is one that has an impact on the body. And therefore, if there's a hidden element of dimyon in the mind and an unrefined space of imagination where it's still stuck in this chaotic element of the Malchei Edom, the kings of Edom, the Edomite kings, which comes from a language of dimyon, which is where they imagine themselves to be like God. Ana emloch, I am in charge, it's only me. So then it's not clarified. It's not clarified, and each and every person is going to actually find themselves experiencing real deficiency in this world. To remind the person that they're imperfect. To remind the person that they're imperfect. There's no righteous individual in the world who does only good without transgressing the boundary. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that the tzaddikim fall in the way that we fall. Even the slightest deviation from the innermost point of a person's direction is considered as a chet. But that's rooted in the fact that nobody's perfect. A righteous person, someone who's truly righteous, would theoretically be someone who only does goodness. But there's no such thing in reality. Why? The issue is that imagination comes and makes a person feel like, oh, I'm all good. I'm all good. Everything is all good. That's certainly true. Hashem is all good. The world is all good. But I'm all good. I'm all good, I'm perfect, I've got it worked out together. That's not the avodah. The avodah is to realize that Hashem is all good, the world is all good, the Torah is all good, the tzaddikim are all good. But me, I have to come to terms with the deficiency and attach myself to goodness, not the source of goodness. I have goodness within me that gives me the strength to know that tzaddik yesod olam, and to attach ourselves to the goodness, the tovu, the ganuz begave, to attach ourselves to the tov haganus, but that's not because we're rectified and perfect in our holiness. It's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the secret of a soul. And so when a person comes to imagine themselves as perfect and the world looks straight and everything is fine, so that's already where a person loses the way. And this goodness that they're experiencing is not really goodness. It's a continuation of that transgression away from the innermost point, because it's not really good. It's only good in accordance to the imagination of it, which is rooted in the Yetzer, that drive which tells me that I can be perfect. Now, this is from the lower element of the dimyon, which we said is the lower third of thinking. But in truth, this issue of dimyon doesn't affect the true nature of thinking, which is thoughtful thinking, which is when I'm aware that neshama shenasata bi tahoirahi, that Hashem, it's you who is sending your thoughts into me. It's you who's sending thoughts into me. It's you who gives me the ability to think. Atachainin la'adam da'as, melami la'enosh bina, chaneinu meitcha, that there's a request, God, give me wisdom, give me the ability to think. Give me the ability to contemplate. Give me the ability to have moichen in this world. In that place of machshava, of chachma, where a person realizes koach ma va'anachnu ma, that my thinking is not coming from me, but rather it's a direct expression from Hashem, so then that area of thinking is not going to be affected by these negative demyonos of thinking that I can be perfect, because I know that the thought is coming from God. And that's why chachma is always the place of bittul. It's always a place of the nullification of self in the face of the annihilating light of the infinite that is flowing through the self. And that's the secret of the chachma shebamoach. That chachma shebamoach, that place is freed from the symptoms of imagination. There's still imagination there because imagination is a rectified thing, as we're going to see. But it's not a destructive form of imagination where a person can fall prey into this myth of perfection, which is the source of all transgression. Because when it comes to the chachma that's in the mind, which is the secret of neshama, shenasatabi tahira, it's a secret of the neshama. The neshama is bina, and that's the heart. And the mind is chachma, which is the chaya. No, but as we saw already, that the true nature of thinking is when the nekuda of chachma, the nekuda of the chaya, which is the world of chachma, extends itself down into the innermost point of the heart, which is the nekuda of bina, because chachma and bina are fundamentally rooted together, and that's the truest nature of thinking, a machshava of chachma that extends itself down into the lave so that it becomes a real lived frame of experience rather than some transcendental ideal that just hangs out in the mind. So the truth of the matter is that the chachma in the mind is protected from this negative symptomology of dimyon, where a person comes to conceive of themselves as perfect. Ki yadua, as we know, the naran, the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama, that the neshama is in the mind, the neshama is in the moach. We know that the three elements of embodied self is the nefesh, ruach, and the neshama, the body, the heart, the site of feeling and emotion, and neshama, the thinking mind. And we know that the neshama rests within the mind, and that comes v'hime Hashem yisparach. The thought is from Hashem, and when a person realizes that the thought is from Hashem, a person is not going to fall prey to thinking that they're perfect, no matter how wondrous their thinking is. They'll always recognize that Amarti achakmeh v'hiruchayka mimeni. I thought I was wise, but it comes from beyond me. The wisdom comes from beyond me. It's not just that the wisdom is far from me. The wisdom comes from a source that's far. It comes from a place beyond the machshava stima. It comes from the avira dachia. It comes from the secretion of divine ratzon into existence at every moment. Like the pasuk, Kamosha ne'emar v'yipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, the neshama is breathed into us, meaning to say our thoughts are emergent from the sight of infinitude and they flow down through our minds and they enter into that place of chachma, which is the truest point of the self, which is koach ma, my ability to recognize that there's a light that's flowing through me, and then that feeling gets extended into the emotional and felt sense of the heart's experience in this world. And that's where the rectification takes place, because I'll never think I'm perfect. God breathes my neshama into me, my thoughts, man de nafach v'chulei mitocho nafach, and the one who breathes forth from within the depths of themselves, which is the secret of the thought of man coming from God himself, so to say, which is the secret of the chelek eloikai mimal mamish. Chelek eloikal, it doesn't write mamish here, but it's the same inyan, chelek eloikal. Al kain hi tahira, and as a result of that, the mind is tahor. When I realize that my thoughts are not my own, and that in truth the thinking process is emergent from the depth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it comes directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that I'm not going to run the risk of the broken nature of Dimyon taking me astray and making me think that I can be God, because the one thing that I know is that I'm not God. Valzeh Amru, and this is what Chazal say in Shir Hashirim Rabbah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu liban shel Yisrael. Hashem is the heart of the Jewish people, meaning to say that at the innermost point of the machshava in the mind, which extends itself down into the heart, which is the secret of chachma, which is that midpoint of thinking that is wedged between the source of thinking without thoughts, the machshava stima'a, and thoughts without thinking, which are the ruminations, which we just discussed. The machshava, the chachma itself is the koachma, is thoughtful thinking. That is emergent into our minds by way of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that place in our minds. Kamosha ne'emar, as it's written, Sur levavi v'chelki, it's you, Hashem, that's my heart. You are my chelek. And it's chachma and bina, it's the mind and the heart. Why? Ki moicha v'liba trein rein kenizkar. We already said that the truest nature of thinking is when chachma and bina are unified together, when the thought construction and the possibility of the configuration of meaning to give shape to existence mends and melds itself rather with the emotional reservoirs of the heart, where it becomes visceral and lived in the deepest way imaginable. As a result of the neshama resting within the mind, Zehu nikra chelki. This is why it's referred to as chelek eloikai, because the chelek of Hashem in me is going to me in my thinking. And if it's a thought that I'm thinking, then naturally it's going to express itself in the heart as well. That's the secret of true thinking, where I'm protected. I'm no longer under threat of the destructive dimyon. I'm no longer the threat of destructive dimyon, which is thinking that I'm perfect, which is thinking that something can be perfect. Only Hashem is perfect. Only Hashem can be perfect. We are perpetually moving towards relative perfection and then coming to realize that in relation to the next level of grasp, in relationship to the next moment, what I thought I had as perfect is in truth revealed to be imperfect, not because I was bad, but because there's so much flowing down. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so generous. There's such shefa that's coming down in each and every moment. The Torah HaKadosh is coming down in each and every moment. Every moment in a person's life is a new Ak and Abiyah, the 5 worlds and the 5 layers of self and the 5 experiences in this world, which are all condensed into the fractalized moment that holds the entirety of history. And then the next moment emerges, and then I have a new ability to do it again. It's endless. And when a person realizes this, then they're going to come to realize that not only can I not be perfect, but the notion of perfection is a mistaken idea. And the reason I'm not perfect is because it doesn't take away my strength, because it just means that I'm owning the fact that my strength comes from beyond me, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu thinks through me, so to say. But nevertheless, after explaining the difference between the symptoms of the lowest part of machshava, where a person, when they lose control of their thinking, they create all of these false narratives in their lives. But even on the higher levels of thought, there's an element of dimyon, like we said. There's always an element of malchus, meaning to say that dimyon exists even in the more refined spaces of the mind, which means that dimyon is not just a post-traumatic symptom, but rather the site of a new way of relating to Hashem, which is biyad hanaviyim adama, which is the secret of nevuah. And it only gets defiled when it goes down, because malchus is the lowest externalization, but in truth, malchus in its purity retains its unity no matter what. In truth, however, all of these dimyonos that a person experiences, lest a person think that once we've set up this differentiation between clarified thought, which knows that it's not perfect, and the broken nature of dimyonos, which come to assume that they are perfect, lest we think that they're fundamentally separate from one another, comes along Rav Tzadok to be made Litz Yosher and Klal Yisrael. Rav Tzadok is always ensuring that whatever he has degraded to being a lower level, if it's connected to the Jews, it will always be returned back to and elevated back up to also being part of the secret. And that even though it might be a different iteration of the secret than the royal path, but nevertheless, there is no element of Yiddishkeit, of Jewishness that Rav Tzadok allows to wait outside of the circle. Everything is redeemable. And so all of these dimyonos, however destructive they may be, in truth, in truth, they're not the essence of self, but rather they're externalized garments that surround, that encircle the innermost point of thinking. That chachma, that koachma, which is not something that is subject to defilement or perversion. That Chazal, when describing the transgressions of Klal Yisrael, the descent that each and every Jew experiences on their own subjective levels into that place, and the ikr chet is forgetting Anuchi Hashem Elokecha, which is coming to think that I'm God, that all of these chatayim, all of these things that we bring with us can be compared to the wheels that allow the grains to move, because there's a certain motivational strength that comes from this intensity. Because in truth, the true essence is not the levushim, not the ever-changing wheels that are driving something, but rather it's the innermost point of the mind and the heart at the core of the Jewish individual, which is the chachma shebemocho, the neshama shenasati b'tahorehi, in this purified place of machshavas charetz, of that place of gold in the mind. In that place, mum ein bach, there's no deficiency. Ki yadua divrei Rambam, as we know from the Rambam, Sof Parak Beis, Hilchos Gerushin, Betam Koifena Sheyad Sheyom Ratzani, that in truth a person can be compelled to give a get to their wives even if they refuse. The get needs to be given volitionally, and it was done under compulsion. So what the Rambam teaches us is that the compulsion is there to reveal an inner volition. And if the compulsory act is something that reveals the fact that a person truly wants in their innermost core to do the right thing, so then ultimately the doing the right thing is more definitive about the person than their resistance against it. Meaning to say, the essential thing is goodness. All of the surrounding things are the not so good things. הלבושים דמחשבה פועלים לפי שעה קצת גם בפנימיוס, דהיינו בלבושים שבפנימיוס, כי גם בפנימיוס המחשבה יש מה שדו לבוש שלדו כמו שנסבר. And even though when we talk about dimyon in its active way and the rectifications that have to take shape with dimyon in its activity are with regards to the externalized levushim of the self, nevertheless, from the lowest level, we can understand the influence that it has on the higher level, and the dimyon on the lowest level is also affecting the dimyon on the interior level, and that dimyon on the interior level is affecting the dimyon on the highest of levels. And so Rav Tzadok gives us three principles here. He says that the truest nature of thinking is thoughtful thinking, where I enable myself to create meaning in this world, where I wake up in the morning and say, Hashem, I'm going to be the architect of my narrative in accordance to the power of the tzaddikim who I live with, and the books that I live with, and the ideas that I live with, and the light of Torah and faith and goodness and affirmation that I live with. I am going to create that narrative. I am going to reconfigure reality, and my machshava is going to be what determines the external shape of things. But then there's also going to be the possibility of when thought loses its primary function, which is the pointed nature of making a frame, and then it descends down into those thoughts without a thinker. So there's a risk that the imagination is going to drag the Yetzer Hara into this place where the individual now utilizes their thinking or their imagination to be perfect. To conceive of themselves as perfect, which is the original transgression, which is the first mistake that Adam Arishon made in forgetting the fact that only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perfect. The chait, as we saw from the brothers Rabbi Melech of Lezhensk and Rav Zusha, was in fact to prove this fact, that even after eating from the tree of knowledge, we still remained imperfect. But nevertheless, the entire history of man, and until the arrival of Mashiach, and even after the arrival of Mashiach, and all of the ascensions after Mashiach, is to teach one thing and one thing only, but the secret joy that comes up from below, from within this place of imperfection, is unfathomably greater than something that would have come alone from perfection itself. And then Rav Tzadok restores and says that even though dimyon and imagination can be considered a destructive thing, nevertheless, it's going to be something that plays a role at each and every level of the self. Once we have this protective device against destructive imagination in place, we're going to dig deeper, be'ezras Hashem, into the redemption of imagination and into how this element of the imagination that's connected to thinking can also be utilized for good, be'ezras Hashem.